Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me this evening. So I always had a bit of a gripe with archaeology. Because on the one hand, it seems like the most thrilling field in science. It's really getting at the deepest questions we can ask about ourselves as human beings. Who we are, where we came from, how we spread around the world, these big meaty questions about us and our history. But on the other hand, whenever I actually visited an archaeological dig, it just looked like the most boring work in the world. A bunch of people who were sunburned, sitting around in the dirt with little toothbrushes or dental picks, just picking off dirt off pot shards, tossing into a pile. It seemed so tedious. And there was kind of this big disconnect between the amazing things that archaeology can address and the day-to-day grind of the work. So you can imagine my delight when I discovered the field of experimental archaeology. So experimental archaeologists do things. They actively recreate the past. They brew Viking beer. They make human mummies. They drive chariots. They play the Aztec ball game. They build rickety ships, and they head out onto the ocean with all the verve of Indiana Jones. It's a very active field. Some people call it not just experimental archaeology, but experiential archaeology, or even living archaeology. It really does resurrect the past. And I especially appreciate how sensory-rich the field is. You can hear the boom of medieval cannons. You can smell what ancient tanned leather smelled like. And I got to eat all sorts of unusual foods. Everything from caterpillars to ostrich egg to guinea pigs to acorns. I tried walrus at one point. I loved every second of this field. So today I want to talk a little bit about experimental archaeology. So each chapter in the book recreates a day in the life of a person from one era in Earth's history. So there's a chapter set in ancient Egypt, a chapter set in ancient Rome. There's a chapter in Viking times, a chapter in sub-Saharan Africa, all of these different places. And basically you're going through a day in the life of that person. You wake up on the kind of bed they would have slept on. You ate what they had for breakfast. You experience life as they did it, using experimental archaeology to kind of bring those things alive. And unusually, the book does combine fiction with nonfiction. There are fictional sections and then nonfictional sections interspersed in between them. I'm going to leave the fictional sections for the book and talk a bit more about the nonfiction experience, things that archaeologists are doing, and some things that I experienced as well. So I'm going to start with one of the most famous archaeological discoveries in history of Ötzi, the Iceman. So Ötzi was discovered inside a melting glacier in 1991. Some hikers in the Alps saw the glacier melting, saw his body there. They got the archaeologists in there to work on him, to try to salvage him. He's 5,300 years old, and he's incredibly well preserved. We know what his last meal was based on the food in his stomach. He had ibex meat and some grains. We know he was murdered. They found an arrow in his back, so he was killed, actually. And oddly, he was very heavily tattooed. You can see he had 61 tattoos all over his body. Most were little lines or little crosses, and a lot of them were at joints. So they think it was some sort of medicinal rite. If you had aching joints or something, you would get a tattoo to try to help with that. You know, not what we would do nowadays, but that's apparently what they were kind of thinking back then. There was a mystery, though, of how did they actually apply these tattoos. Obviously, there were no tattoo guns in the past to do this, so how did they actually get them on there? And the main theory was that they had taken some sort of stone blade, like obsidian, they had cut the skin, then they had rubbed soot into that skin. That seemed like about all they would have had the technology for back then. But of course, there was no proof of this. It was just a bunch of people theorizing about this is what they must have done. And sadly, this is sort of a shortcoming of some areas of archaeology. People are theorizing about hunting who have never been hunting before. People are theorizing about how to make leather when they have never tanned to hide themselves. And people who are theorizing about how they got tattoos when they have never gotten a tattoo themselves, much less given one. So experimental archaeologists took over, and they did kind of an ingenious experiment. So an archaeologist who works on tattoos got a hold of a tattoo artist in New Zealand who specializes in hand-poke tattooing. So he takes a needle and he pokes it and drives the ink under the skin. And he pitched this guy, hey, I think we should do an experiment. where you give yourself 8 identical tattoos. You can see what the design is right there, like a bunch of stacked triangles. Give yourself 8 identical tattoos with different methods in each case. Use a bone needle one time, a different type of needle for another one, and we'll also use the obsidian cut and rub method, and we'll see how this compares to Ötzi's tattoos. So this tattoo artist said, that's great, I want to do this. Let's do this experiment. And this took him, he did this on his left thigh, so it was about right here. He's very heavily tattooed, so this is about the only spot he had left, was on his left thigh there. So he put them down. It took him 8 hours, no, excuse me, 8-hour day? No, it was a 12-hour day, actually. 8 tattoos over 12 hours. But the time and pain was not equally distributed over all of these tattoos. Some of them took him about 15 minutes, pretty lickety-split, got them done. One of the tattoos, though, took him 3 hours to do. It was a method that they used in the Arctic where they would take a needle and they would have a long thread, a leather thread behind it that was soaked in ink. They would actually sew the skin and they would draw it through, and that's how it would apply it. So that's how they did it in the Arctic way back when. That one took him 3 hours. He said it was one of the most painful things he's ever done, but it was for science he did this. And it actually paid off with scientific insight in that you can see that the different tattoos left different marks on the skin. So the obsidian ones, you can see, at the end, they kind of taper off into invisibility. They just sort of taper off very gradually into a wisp. Whereas the bone needle ones have sharper, rounder ends on them. And you can also see they look sort of stippled into the skin. It's like one of those old dot matrix printers, if you remember those, where it has a bunch of dots in a row. The bone needle tattoos looked more like that. So then they got some pictures, close-ups of Ötzi's tattoos, and they found that they did not use the cut and rub method. So archaeologists had been wrong this whole time about how the tattoos had been applied. It looked much more like the bone needle tattoos. So we know now that they had this technology we didn't know about back then, that they were actually using bone needles, or some sort of needle at least, to put ink under the skin. So a brand new insight into Ötzi's culture. And now that there is this reference set of different tattoos and what they look like on skin, where we know the method of application, we can go to tattoos from go to mummies from ancient Egypt. We can go to mummies from ancient Peru. We can go to mummies all over the world and figure out now how they applied the tattoos based on this reference set, this experiment. So it was a very, very cool experiment. And in the book, I actually got a hand poke tattoo myself. It's a bit of a debacle. I will leave that for the book. But I did want to talk about one aspect of it. Because after I got my tattoo, I said to the artist, Joseph, thank you, that was great, that was exactly what I wanted. And he's like, oh, glad it worked out for you. And then he said, but, do you want to give me a tattoo now? And I said, yes, I do. I absolutely want to give you a tattoo. So I'm probably a rare person who got and gave their first tattoo ever on the same day, but I got to give him a tattoo. And I should emphasize, I am not the world's best drawer. I have trouble with stick figures even. But he was game. He rolled up his pant leg and had me put it on the sort of the fleshy part of your shin on the side there. So he rolled up his pant leg, and I asked, what do you want? And he said, just a little line segment or something. And I said, okay, I can do that. But as he rolled up his pant leg, I saw he had a bunch of other line segments on there. There were like 10 or 15 of these little line segments. And so I said, well, what's the deal? Well, you've had other people do this? And then he told me kind of this magical story. So way back in the Arctic, they used to have facial tattoos. So this was very common, especially among women. They would have facial tattoos. And then, 100 or so years ago, maybe more recently than in some places, missionaries came in, colonialists came in. They basically stamped the practice out. They said, we don't want you doing this anymore. They made them give this practice up. But there are some elderly women who are alive today who remember their grandmothers or their great-grandmothers had these facial tattoos. And they kind of wanted to revive the practice and, keep their culture alive in this way if they could. But they had no idea how to tattoo. They had never done this before. So this guy, this tattoo artist, flew them down from Alaska down to California, gave them a lesson on tattooing, and then essentially rolled his pant leg up and let them use his leg as a doodle pad to practice because they needed to practice somehow. So I thought it was this really wonderful story. And there is a good lesson in there too, because in some cases that I'm going to be talking about and I talk about in the book, it's professional archaeologists doing this. They have a degree from a university, a PhD, and they're working in labs or whatever, taking data. It's professional archaeology work. But in a lot of cases, it's not that. It's indigenous people or native people in places whose cultures have lost some things, or they're trying to keep their culture alive in certain ways. And in some cases, they are the ones going to archaeologists and correcting them about how things were done because they know from their past or from their culture, it couldn't have been done this way. It must have been done this way. So for a lot of these people, it isn't just sort of this experiment that they're doing. It really is living archaeology to them. And I think that's one nice aspect of the field is that it's not just scientists doing it. There are people out there who are living this work too and keeping it alive and really bringing it into modern time. So it's kind of a nice little thing wrapped up in this tattoo story that they're going to be trying to revive this ancient practice. So thought that was kind of cool. Yep. And I'm going to move on to another set of mummies in ancient Egypt. So one thing I did not know before writing the book was that we really don't know a lot of details about some important things in ancient Egypt. So for instance, the pyramids, maybe the most iconic thing about Egypt, we really don't know how they got the blocks up there. We just have no idea how they did that. They didn't leave records about it. So in the book, I talk about some theories, some plausible theories, some less plausible theories about how they actually built the pyramids. And similar to that, with mummies, probably the other iconic thing about Egypt, we don't know a lot of the details about how they made mummies. But experimental archaeology can teach us some things. So another kind of cool factoid about Egypt was that they mummified humans, of course, but they also mummified animals. And they mummified animals on giant industrial scales. They mummified pretty much any animal you can think of. Baboons, hyenas, alligators, shrews, lions, beetles, lizards, owls, pretty much anything they could mummify, they did. And again, they made these on huge, huge scales. They have found graveyards there, burial yards there, where they found 4 million bird mummies, and another one had 7 million dog mummies in this. They were making these on giant scales. You would get one, and you would make an offering to a god or something at a temple, and then you would bury it. That was sort of the offerings that they made. But now, of course, no one would want to do this in modern times with a human, that we just wouldn't be able to do that. Except a few experimental archaeologists decided they did want to do this, and in 1994, they started an experiment where they actually mummified a human being. They did this in Baltimore. One was an Egyptologist, and one was head of the Maryland State Anatomy Board. So someone had donated their body to science, and instead of it going to a medical school or for another scientific purpose, they decided they were going to take it and they were going to mummify it. And I can show you the Egyptologist that I talked to. This is Bob Breyer. He is working on an Egyptian mummy right there. And he was quite a character. He was a lot of fun to talk to for the book. He had a lot of stories about everything he did. But again, they took this mummy, the modern one, from a pool of people who donated their bodies to science. It was a 76-year-old man who had died of a heart attack, and his identity remains a secret. They kept him anonymous, but they gave him a nickname of E.M. Balm. So M. Balm, har, yeah, just to kind of give him a name and like that. And they went all out to be authentic here. They had replica copper and obsidian blades made. And Breyer actually flew out to Egypt to get the drying agent that they used. It's a mineral called natron. It's basically a mix of baking soda and salt. Chemically, that's what it is. And it forms naturally in gullies and wadis, by dry riverbeds there in Egypt. So he flew over there and got a shovel out and was digging all this stuff up and got a lot of this stuff, hundreds of pounds of this stuff. And he said one of the most ticklish aspects of the whole work was having to smuggle this unidentified white powder back in through customs at JFK Airport when he got back. But he managed to get it in there, brought it down to Maryland, and they started this experiment. And again, they went all out to be authentic. They had stone tools made. So you can see some of the tools there. There's some copper blades and there's some obsidian blades there. And then went through all the steps. We do know some of the steps that they would have gone through, like the basic ideas, but there were big questions we did not know. So they went through the steps. I'll go through those a bit more, where they removed some of the organs, and then they preserved some of the organs. They discarded other organs. And then they washed the body out inside with palm wine. It's a step they took back then, washing the body. Then they put the natron, the mineral, in linen bags. They packed that inside the body. Then they piled several hundred more pounds of natron on top, which you can see here. They were pouring the natron on top of Mr. Balm there. And again, I go into a lot more detail in the book, but this was, as you can imagine, a very controversial experiment. There were a lot of other archaeologists and Egyptologists who were not happy about this. One person called it macabre and tasteless. Another person said it had no scientific value. Another person complained and said, when you donate your body to science, this should not be just a blank check to do any experiment you want to on this body. And I understand that point. I think that last one especially is a good point. But as Breyer made the argument, they really treated this body well. I mean, they treated him like a pharaoh would have been treated. And his body's probably going to be in a lot better shape than any of our bodies will be in 100 years because he is preserved. He is still in an office in Maryland today, perfectly preserved. And I do think it's not fair to say there was no scientific value here because they did learn a lot about the mummification process. One thing they learned is that copper tools did not cut nearly as well as the stone tools, the obsidian tools they had made. So I think most of us probably would have thought it would have been the opposite, that the metal tools would have worked better. But no, the stone tools were actually much sharper and much better at opening the body up and getting the organs out. So that was one thing they learned. Another question they had was, is it really possible to get the organs out? The mummies they see, there's a pretty small incision in there. And they have to get the lungs out, they have to get the liver out. How are we going to do this? But, they had an anatomist there, an expert in this, and they were able to sort of Tetris it out and get the liver and the lungs out of there without having to chop them into pieces or anything like that. They got the brains out as well. As you might know, the Egyptians did not preserve the brain. They actually removed it with a hook through the nose. And they had to figure out how did they do that. And I will not spoil it for you, but they did figure out how they got the brain out in this experiment, something we did not know before. They figured out how long it took, around 4 months or so. They figured out how much natron it took, about 800 pounds. They figured out how much body weight a mummy loses due to just loss of water, over 100 pounds on someone who was, I think, about 170 before. So they lost a lot of body weight just through water. And the big question that Breyer wanted to know is, he's seen Egyptian mummies. You can see, if we go back a few pictures, you can see that's kind of the classic look of Egyptian mummies. Their skin turns brown, and the skin on their face especially contracts, and it pulls back from the teeth, it pulls back from the eyes. And Breyer wanted to know, well, is that the mummification process that's doing that? Or is it the fact that they've been sitting in Egypt, a very dry climate, for 3,000 or 3,500 years? What is actually causing that classic mummy look? And Breyer said that he was amazed. They had to change the natron a few times over those 4 months. But he was amazed that when they opened it up the first time to put fresh natron on there, he said that body, Mr. Balm, looked exactly like Ramses the Great. It was a stunning, stunning replica of what Ramses the Great looked like. And so he said he knew instantly it was the mummification process that actually gave Egyptian mummies their classic look. And so this is something we can learn through these experiments about one of the most iconic cultures on Earth. And I do have a little surprise here. So I mentioned a moment ago that the Egyptians made a lot of animal mummies as well. And I actually, in writing the book, made an animal mummy myself. I mummified a fish, and I have brought the mummy fish to show you here. So I'm going to unwrap this as we go here. And I'll explain. I did this in Washington, D.C., which is where I live. And I bought this during the summer, which in retrospect might not have been the best time of year to buy that, because if you know Washington, D.C., it is a swamp in the summer. It is not nice there in the summer. But I did it during the summer, got a whole fish, opened it up, got the insides out. And this fish has never seen the inside of a refrigerator. And again, it was in Washington, D.C. During the summer. But all I had to do was put down some natron. So I got some baking soda and salt at the grocery store, mixed them together, got a casserole dish, made a nice little bed of that, put the fish on top, poured more over the top. And 2 or 3 weeks later, I had a perfectly mummified fish. And it has been sitting on my shelf since then, perfectly preserved. I will have it out afterward. You can come up and see it. But the eye especially, they're beautiful. They are perfectly well preserved. You can see its teeth and its tongue in there. It is beautifully well preserved. I dropped it here. That was my fault. That's why it's dangling there. But it is beautifully well preserved. So this is something, beyond food, which is kind of an easy thing to do. This is a very, very easy thing that people can do. You can make a fish mummy or any other animal you want. Fish is probably the easiest to get a hold of. But I was amazed how simple it was and how good a job it did of making a mummy. So there we go, the fish mummy. We'll leave that up there. In the next part, I want to talk about another activity that I did. I went down to Mexico, and I'm going to actually read a bit in a moment here. But I went down to Mexico. Let me just start this. I went down to Mexico to do a chapter about the Aztec and the Aztec culture. So a day in the life of someone in the Aztec Empire. And while I was down there, I knew I wanted to play the infamous Aztec ball game. So a lot of people know about this. They especially know one thing about it is that the losers were often sacrificed. So you really had an incentive to play this game well. But I got to go down, and they are reviving this game nowadays. The Spanish nearly quashed it, nearly destroyed it, and wiped it out. But it was always surviving in rural areas of Mexico, and gradually it's getting back to places like Mexico City, and it's growing more popular there. So this game is a bit unusual. I think the next picture, there's some animal mummies there. Here's the game, and here's how you gameplay right here. So as you can see, there's a ball involved in this game, and it's unusual in that you can't touch the ball with your hands, and you don't use your feet to actually touch it. What you do is you use your hips. You knock the ball around with your hips. And my instructor, when he was telling me about this, he said the motion you use, he said, do a Shakira. So you do this, and you bring your hip up like this. You twist your hip, and you hit it like that, and the ball bounces off. And there are 2 things that happen during the game. So you serve the ball, you toss it to the other team, and then you're knocking it back and forth with your hip, and it's bouncing back and forth. And it was a lot of fun when the ball was bouncing back and forth. But this ball is made of rubber, so it's really bouncy. It's bouncy like a basketball. But they did not have the technology then to put an air bladder in the middle. So it is solid rubber all the way through, and they can weigh up to 15 pounds. This one was a little less that I played with, but they can be very heavy. It's like a soft padded bowling ball, essentially, that you are knocking around with your hips. So this is what this game is like. And basically you have 2 teams, you're knocking it back and forth. I got some practice where I got to, try hitting it. And the other important detail for this story is that, again, because the ball is so heavy, after a while you're hitting it back and forth, the ball ends up rolling along the ground. And when it's rolling along the ground, you can't hit it with your foot, you can't touch it with your hands. You have to drop down to the pavement and use your hip, even when it's rolling, sort of like a ping pong paddle, and just hit it back. And then you have to pop back up to your feet, because if you're not back on your feet when the other team hits it, that's a penalty. So you have to drop down, hit it back over and over. So that's kind of how the gameplay worked. And then, and the last thing to know is that there were 2 teams, and there were a bunch of people there, a dentist, a physical therapist, and there was one team where a woman, the PT, she had brought her 11-year-old daughter along. So that's a detail that's important here. So I'm going to read a short section here. Speaking of which, however unprepared to play the game, I am soon thrust into the match that the others are playing. I am told to choose which team I want to join. Classic playground torment. I glance back and forth, cringing with the knowledge that whichever team I pick will likely lose. Cravenly, I select the side with the 11-year-old child, hoping that she will shoulder some of the blame if we don't do well. In the version of the game that we are playing, You score points by knocking the ball past your opponent's end line. I quickly realized that this style of the ball game is really two sports in one, depending on whether the ball is still bouncing or not. When it is bouncing, it is a madcap combination of soccer and tennis. You are constantly trying to wrong foot your opponents by knocking the ball at strategic angles and making them scurry side to side. Finally, you punch the ball in for a score. It is fast, fun, and dynamic. Unfortunately, when the ball loses momentum and starts rolling along the ground, the game deteriorates into Wide World of Sports as presented by Dante. Again, you can only return the ball with your hip, which means throwing yourself onto the ground over and over. Imagine doing 100 burpees in a row, except every time you drop, you have to hip punch a bowling ball the other direction. My thighs begin quaking from all the up and down, and my already poor form deteriorates into flailing. My legs are soon so shot that I can't even enjoy the aerial gameplay. The other team is also putting weird English on the ball now, spinning it like pool sharks. This throws off the timing of my hip thrusts. One time, the ball slams into my shin. Another time, it blasts my rib cage. When it smacks my quad once, I crumple like a sniper took me out. Shamefully, I spend the last half of the game hiding behind the 11-year-old child and letting her return shots that were meant for me. In my defense, she is much better at the game than I am. She is fearless and agile. I have never before felt like the proverbial little league right fielder, silently begging the team not to hit the ball my way, making irresponsible promises to God. But that's what the Aztec ball game has reduced me to. And it really gave me an appreciation for how tough people were back then, because they would play this game for hours and hours, sometimes days on end at a time. They considered it training for their warriors when they would go off to war. So they took it very seriously, and this was really a good way to toughen them up. So I really got a new appreciation for how tough people were back then. And I'm going to wrap up with a bit more of a forward-looking story. Still experimental archaeology, but does look a little bit forward. And I have a few slides here I'm just going to mention quickly. So again, I got to try different types of food. These were some insects that I ate down in Mexico. Some were delicious, some were less than delicious, but all interesting to try. I got to spend an afternoon with someone who had built a giant 30-foot medieval catapult. So he spent a day hurling these giant stones around at this wooden palisade that he'd built and smashing the stones into them. So that was kind of fun. I got to try my hand at ancient surgery at one point. An operation called a trepanation, where they open a hole in the skull to relieve pressure on the brain or to get broken bits of bone out of there. But I'm going to wrap up with a future-looking story, also related to medicine, that involves this right here. This is Bald's Leech Book. Leech is ye old slang for doctor, so it's basically a book for doctors, a leech book. It's 1,000 years old, and it was unearthed in a monastery. And we don't really know a lot about the details, about who owned it, things like that. It's all kind of mysterious. But essentially, it's a bunch of recipes that doctors would have used to make medicine for different ailments. And some of these recipes are pretty obvious nonsense. One of them from this era talks about getting a virgin to gather water from an eastward flowing spring that will cure any ailment of the heart, which does not seem all that likely to work, but that's what they tried back then. But there were a few recipes in there that looked different, that looked like maybe they might work. And a few professors in England, in Nottingham in England, they decided they wanted to try this. One was a professor of Viking studies, which is a very cool job title. I always like that. And the other was a microbiologist, Freya Harrison. And the recipe they made involved a solve, or a solution. So a solution with a bunch of bits mixed in. It was a cure for styes, which are infections of the eyelash follicle. And sometimes they're minor, but it's an infection in your body that can get into your eye, it can blind you, or if it spreads, it can even kill you. So this could be a very serious matter. And this solve consisted of wine, chopped onions and garlic, and you mix that in a bowl, in a copper bowl, and then you add ox gall to it, so bile from the liver of an ox. Those are the ingredients in this thing. You apply it with a feather. So you dip a feather in, and you brush it lightly on the eye because it's infected, it's painful. And they've looked at this recipe and they said, well, wine is antiseptic. Onions and garlic have some antiseptic properties. Maybe this could work. Let's try an experiment. And sort of in parallel with them, I made some of this stuff at my home too. You can see I made some red wine one there and some white wine one there. Otherwise, they were exact same ingredients. Just got the onion and the garlic from my grocery store, the wine from there too. The ox gall, believe it or not, was not that hard to find. It's an ingredient in microbiology labs nowadays. And for whatever reason, there are certain types of bacteria, if you mix the ox gall in there, they turn a certain color. Other bacteria don't turn that color. So it's a useful way to stain bacteria and tell them apart. So you can find ox gall online. It was very easy to get. And I didn't have copper bowls, so I got some pennies from the bank, nice shiny pennies, plopped them in there, and you let it sit for 9 days. And this is what it looked like after 9 days. So it turned colors. The red wine one looked pretty gray, I would say. The white wine one looked a bright green, like a nice copper green, kind of like the Statue of Liberty. So that's what that looked like. The most disconcerting part was probably the pennies at the bottom, because those were bright and shiny when I got them, and they looked like I had scorched them with a blowtorch afterward. They were really in rough shape. So something chemically was going on in there. And again, the professors, they actually wanted to try an experiment. They made this, and one of them, as I said, is a microbiologist. So she decided to use this on bacteria. And she wanted to make sure she was using a pretty intense test case here. So she decided to use it on some pretty tough bacterial customers. One was staph, which you can see a picture of here, and the other was gonorrhea. And she chose strains specifically that are resistant to modern drugs. So we don't really have a lot of drugs that can fight these that well because they're resistant to these modern drugs. And she tried this 1,000-year-old recipe that they found in some medieval monastery, and it walloped these drug-resistant bacteria, just wiped them right out. So they were very impressed with this. And things got even more interesting because Freya Harrison, the microbiologist, she's an expert in what are called biofilms. So in your body, when you have an infection, bacteria, they kind of clump together, and often they kind of link arms, and they start secreting this goop. And this goop is basically a protective barrier that prevents things like drugs, pharmaceuticals, from getting in and killing them. So it's a protective barrier to keep themselves safe. And biofilms are actually kind of tough to crack. And they're one reason why some drugs that work well in test tubes or in the lab just don't work all that well in living beings because the drug can't get through the biofilm. But they tried this 1,000-year-old recipe, and it blasted right through the biofilm as well. So they were very impressed at how good this stuff was. And they are currently trying to develop this solve into a treatment in clinical trials to develop a treatment that we could see maybe someday in a hospital, in a clinic. So it's very humbling to think that this recipe, this amazing potential solution, has been sitting in this medieval book, people scoffing at it, teasing other recipes in there, overlooking it for nearly 1,000 years. And again, it shows, experimental archaeology can be really fun. And that's, I think, why it's so interesting is how much fun it is. But it can have real practical benefits in modern times and even look to the future as well. So I'm just going to wrap up with a few final thoughts. So at the beginning, I bellyached a little bit about how dull modern archaeological digs can seem sometimes. Just people in the dirt getting pot shards. I was being a bit dramatic, obviously. And I should emphasize that we know a lot about the past because of traditional archaeology. It is very, very important. Most of what we know about the past is from these people, these men and women, millions of them doing this incredible work. But hopefully, the talk tonight, and the book especially, proves that there is more to archaeology than just moving dirt. If archaeology wants to illuminate the lives of everyday people in the past, then it also needs the sights, the sounds, the smells, the tastes of those people's lives, what they were doing every single day of their lives. And experimental archaeology, getting out and actually doing and making things, it can provide a welcome corrective. I think in some ways we're kind of disconnected from our past. We don't think about it as much. I feel like we're kind of cut off from our heritage and the way that most human beings lived for most of modern Homo sapiens existence. We really live a very different lifestyle. But I think experimental archaeology can be a bit of a corrective for that, because when you're doing something, it makes the material a little more spiritual. We live in kind of a throwaway culture where tools, textiles, meals, we just buy them, then we get rid of them. But when you're making something, when you're actually putting some of yourself into that thing, it means a lot more to you. It does become a little bit spiritual because you put something of yourself into it and you transformed it. And experimental archaeology is not the easiest field. There are plenty of stories in the book of me floundering around, getting these sort of Three Stooges injuries, doing all sorts of dumb things, failing over and over. But the past wasn't always comfortable for our ancestors either. But they stuck things out. And in fact, if they hadn't stuck things out, we would not be here. So I think the least we can try to do is understand them on their own terms. And experimental archaeology, living archaeology, can do that in a way that no other field can. So again, thank you all for coming out tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was very interesting and insightful. We do have a little bit of time for some questions before we move to the audience, the book signing. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll come around to you.
In your book, You Buy an Ostrich Egg. How many omelets do you make from it?
I do not remember off the top of my head how many omelets I got out of this ostrich egg, but I did eat an ostrich egg. It's about yay big, about cantaloupe sized or so. I ordered it online. You can get them online. There are ostrich farms around. It came swaddled in diapers, which I thought was kind of interesting, protective barrier. It came with instructions, too, about how to open it, because I guess people didn't. They recommended using a nail to open it, but I actually used a stone tool that had someone made me. So I just sat there and kind of grinded on it and got it open eventually. It was a big pain, but eventually I did get it open. And I would say, at least 5 or 6 omelets, about that big. I mean, just from one egg. So it was pretty incredible. And I will say the ostrich egg yolk was one of the most delicious things I have ever eaten. Very rich, very umami-y. It was really delicious. The whites were not that good. I didn't have a lot of experience cooking with something like that. It's a different consistency than regular eggs. They just ended up sort of gooey and almost a little snotty even. Not the most appetizing. But the yolks I can highly recommend.
All right, ostrich yolks, you can buy them off Amazon. All right, next question. Any other questions? Oh, okay.
I'm interested in ancient metallurgy and about how mercury was refined in different continents and whatnot, which I find amazing. Just the idea that they're trying to cook stone and figure out what they can get from it. So one of my questions is, the ancient Colombians had developed that, it's not gold plating, gold coating of their metal mixes. Is there any other ancient culture that figured out something that similar?
I don't know for sure off the top of my head. It depends on how ancient you're talking and sort of what era you're talking. So I'm pretty sure like the Egyptians and things were able to do that, and they were probably doing this, 2500 BC. So I don't know how the ancient Colombian, how old that was, but yeah, I think there were definitely cultures working with gold and making things like that. I mean, like even King Tut's mask sort of famously has gold and stuff on that. So I don't know a lot of the details there, but I'm pretty sure there were other cultures using these kind of technologies, yeah.
I like the dinner with King Tut. I like dessert. So part of my question would be, when did start using sugar? I mean, I'm sure they had sugar, but you kind of know when society developed how to make sugar? I mean, they had honey and all that.
Yeah, I talk about that a little bit in the book in more of a footnote. I think it's still in there. It was developed from sugar cane, so that's what they were using. And it slowly spread from, I think it was first cultivated, domesticated in New Guinea, I think, sugarcane, and then it kind of spread from there. It didn't get to Europe until pretty late. So it was in, places like India, and then kind of spread over to the Middle East, and then it got to Europe pretty late. And especially, the farther west you got there, the more expensive it was because the areas of cultivation were way over there. And it got so expensive by the time you got all the way to Europe, like the farthest end of the chain, people were using it more as a spice than they were using it as something, a sweetener. They would just sprinkle a little bit on meat or something because they could only get their hands on a very little bit of it. So it was interesting to see how they used it in a much different way than we would think of nowadays. They weren't putting a lot in, so it was expensive. And they were using it, again, on meats and things as more of a spice. Or as a medicine, because it does cause a physiological reaction. It can make your heart beat a little faster, you can flush a little bit. So they had a very different idea of what sugar was for back then. Not just like a treat, but it was, either a spice or a medicine in some cases.
Hi. When you mummified the fish, did it get smelly? And how do you dispose? How did you dispose of the drying agent?
It smells very weakly, like if you were to boil a fish. That sort of smell, so like a parboil, but it smells just weakly of that. And the natron, the baking soda, and the salt, I just put in the trash. I mean, it was perfectly fine. It just had a little fish juice on it, so yeah, very easy to discard.
All right.
Were the linens treated with anything?
Were the what?
Linen strips, were they treated with something?
Oh, no. I think sometimes in the past they did. I was more focused on the drying part of it than going through like the whole process. I did wrap it up to make it, look kind of cool and interesting, and have the big reveal in the audience. But yeah, I think they did in the past, and sometimes they would actually. They would write things on there. They might write a spell or something on there. Or they would take spells on papyrus and they would wrap it up with the mummy. So they had different things that they would do. They would wash the body in oils and things like that. I was more focused just on the drying part. I did put a little oil on there. That kind of gave it the color that you see. This was a red snapper before it got dried. But yeah, so I did some of the oil and stuff like that. But it was really the natron that dried it out.
No one knows how the pyramids were built. Have they tried to recreate a pyramid and they failed, so therefore they don't know, or is the UFO theory come back into play for that?
I hope not. They have not tried to build a whole pyramid just based on the gargantuan size of their. I think when it was built, I think the biggest one was 480 feet tall, so 48-story building, the top of the pyramids, and those blocks are gigantic. I mean, they're the size of the stage and. This tall. They are huge blocks. They have done experiments where they have tried to just push them around and just see if they could do it. I think a lot of people, naively, I kind of had this idea myself, that you could put down like log rollers or something and just push them along log rollers. They have done experiments with rollers and they are terrible. They really, really do not work. Unless you get them so perfect, probably more perfect than they could have gotten them without modern tools. Unless they're absolutely perfect, they're going to get wonky, they're going to roll around. Plus, you have the problem of people are in you run out of the log rollers. You got to bring them from the front to the back while you're pushing this giant block up something. So it just seems like rollers probably didn't work. The bigger debate now is about ramps and whether they could have built a giant dirt ramp to get all the way to the top of the pyramid. And I think ramps do seem plausible for the beginning stages of it, but I did do an experiment with someone. He's an amateur, an enthusiast in Mississippi, where he built a replica scale pyramid, and we measured the volume it would take to get a sand ramp all the way to the top. And the volume of sand we needed for the ramp was 4 times the volume of the pyramid itself. So it takes a lot of material to get to the very top of the pyramid. And it just makes it seem that much harder to get to the top because if you're using a ramp, just because of the vast amount of material that you would need. So in my mind, that really casts a lot of doubt on the idea that they could have used ramps. He had another idea about this. He built what he called the pyramid machine, where there's a bunch of winches and ropes, and you have people like heaving a beam, and it raises it with ropes. And you can do that on a much steeper angle, so you don't need a ramp. You can just pull it up the side of the pyramid. And who knows whether they did something like the machine he built, but it really does cast doubt on them using a ramp for the very top blocks. But it's still an open mystery as far as we know.
I apologize. I just learned about this talk yesterday, so I didn't do any of my research to any of what you've done before. But I've been fascinated by how your methodology of embedding yourself into this type of work in order to learn about it. And had you been interested in this topic for years and years and years, and you just finally had the chance to get into it? Do you intend to continue working in this area, or what are you moving on to next?
Yeah, I'm moving on to a different book about a different topic. So that won't be about this field. But yeah, I think there's just fascinating stuff out there still. I remember hearing about someone who had made ancient weapons, and they'd basically gotten like a dummy caribou, and they were throwing these weapons at this caribou. It was actually up at Kent State, so it's pretty close here. They have a big experimental archaeology lab at Kent State. So the characters there are popping up over and over in the book. The guy was great. He was fantastic. Yeah, the whole department was great. So I heard about that, and I thought, wow, that's so cool. And I kept hearing about different pieces of it. I think it's more... I think the people involved often are just doing it. Kent State's an exception, but a lot of the people are just archaeologists, and they say, oh, I want to do one experiment one time. It's less a systematic thing for them. Kent State is doing it more systematically. But I just kept hearing about these stories, and I was kind of gathering them together. And I said, even though they might not realize they're part of a movement, there is kind of this movement out there, and I want to write about that. And yeah, I would love to keep doing different things. In the book, the last chapter, the most recent place I go to is the Aztec Empire. So anything past that, I haven't even touched. And there are other places like ancient Greece that I didn't cover in the book. And there are a million other spots around the world where they had different cultures doing things. So there's a lot more stuff out there.
Okay, we have time for maybe one or two more questions.
I did listen to the book and was grossed out in many sections, but
Great. All right.
thoroughly enjoyed it
Yes, okay.
and have recommended it. But what was the time frame from your first trip to your last trip?
So with the trip, I got going with this book, I think it was maybe signed the contract in about February 2020, which was bad timing for a book. I wanted to travel a lot. I was kind of frustrated because my other books are a lot of like archives, research, calling people, talking to them, a little more historical and less me there on the scene. I did all those books when there wasn't a pandemic happening, and as soon as I wanted to do one, was travel, I couldn't go anywhere. So I didn't actually get to go anywhere. I believe Peru was my first trip. Maybe in late 2021, and then I was making trips for the next 3 years or so here and there. But during that dead time, I was doing things like getting acorns and trying to make acorn food, or just doing things I could do at home on my own, as opposed to just taking trips. So.
Well, thank you. It's very fascinating.
Thank you.
All right, we have time for one more. Any last questions?
If you're feeling shy, I and the fish will be here.
All right,
with
well,
the book, so.
sounds good. So thank you so much for coming this evening. You can meet Sam and his fish over here at the author signing table. We do have copies of Dinner with King Tut available in the back if you'd like to purchase a copy from the Learned Owl. And again, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you at a future event. Thanks.